going on, everyone? Welcome to episode 43 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, myself and Zach will be discussing a couple of topics. The first one is just going to be a little warm-up question for us. We're going to talk about the concept of resensitization, specifically for hypertrophy. We might touch a little bit on strength. We'll see. That'll be our warm-up question. Then we will move into a larger discussion on training volume in a caloric deficit. I'm going to talk about body composition considerations and probably try to tie it into strength because I think that is often overlooked, this nutritional periodization concept, especially for strength. So, with that out of the way, I will quickly plug the description or the show notes of this podcast episode. Check out the things we offer. Support the show by leaving a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or if you are really feeling generous, you can leave a rating on both. All right, with that out of the way, Zach, I'll kick this warm-up question over to you. I forgot to put the name down of this individual, but he or she asked, from a hypertrophy standpoint, is it worth it to take 1 to 2 weeks off to quote-unquote resensitize the muscle to future hypertrophy gains?
So I think the important thing to start off with this question is it says resensitize the muscle. The immediate thing I was going to touch on first was what we kind of like to differentiate between physiological versus psychological resensitization. I think from a psychological perspective, taking occasional weeks off training, switching training goals, things like that, all of those can have a ton of positive benefits to continue to allow someone to train with the two most important things, or just as consistency and effort. So I think that's the first thing to keep in mind is that, aside from the theoretical physiological benefits we'll get to here in a second, from a psychological perspective, I use this all the time. This is where you get your things like, pivot blocks or weeks, whatever you want to call those, or just, like I said, even just training with a different goal in mind for a little bit of period of time. And then also just taking a week or two off training if you go on vacation or something like that. That allows you to come back from that period of time and come back to normal hypertrophy training with more effort, consistency, and allow you to kind of do the things are going to get you to where you want to go. Then I think that's a net positive. Now, when it comes from like a physiological perspective, in terms of resensitization, I think there's some things to keep in mind here. There is some evidence to say that resensitization can happen, but I think it's the context in which it does seem to happen that I think potentially gets a little bit over extrapolated a lot of the time when these conversations kind of come around. So the two main studies, I think there's two, that kind of come to mind to show that resensitization can be a thing for hypertrophy are a couple papers by Ogasawara, and where they have one group that trains continuously and then another group kind of takes periodic breaks off, and they eventually end up at the same point relatively in terms of muscle growth. And so the idea there is that because they are training less weeks, the rate of muscle growth when they are training must have been a bit higher in order to reach the same relative point at the end of the study. So those are kind of proof of concept studies in which, with the general caveats of small sample research, all those kind of things in mind, it seems that resensitization can occur to some degree. Now, a couple important limitations with those studies. Obviously, I believe these are untrained individuals, and that is going to bring up the conversation of, is it the fact that they're resensitizing the training, or is it the fact that they're just hitting the cap of gains that they can see within a given amount of time? The ceiling effect, you may have heard that called. So that's definitely a consideration. Another paper that I think people kind of discuss in this concept is a recent paper by Carvalho and colleagues. The one that was, both groups were kind of doing some preconditioning hypertrophy training. Then one group did a short phase of strength training in which the relative training volume was considerably lower by dropping the repetition range and increasing the load. And then the other group just did hypertrophy training the entire time.
Can I cut you off?
Go for it.
I can give you the exact kind of protocol of that because I have it in front of me. So there was a strength plus hypertrophy group, and then there was like a just hypertrophy group. The strength plus hypertrophy, they trained for 3 weeks at an 8 to 12 RM. If I recall correctly, these sets were taken to failure, or at least that was what was described in the paper, followed by 3 weeks with a 1 to 3 RM. So very much strength training. and then 5 weeks at an 8 to 12 RM. So 8 to 12, 1 to 3, and then 8 to 12 RMs. The hypertrophy only group just trained with 11 straight weeks of 8 to 12 RM, just to kind of give the listener a nice overview of the design there.
Yeah. So why I think that study is relevant is because I think on the front end, this was kind of a paper that a lot of people were describing or discussing, testing the hypothesis of does getting stronger and being able to theoretically lift heavier weights in like the hypertrophy rep range lead to greater gains in muscle size. While that may be part of what's going on, I don't find that hypothesis particularly compelling. I think this is kind of one of those resensitization papers in disguise. Now, on this paper, there's a ton of kind of limitations and caveats with the actual gains in muscle size. Not huge absolute differences between groups. There's a lot of details we could go in on this, but that's not the intention of this. But the idea there is that I think that's a really practical example of potentially showing that decreasing training volume substantially could allow you to have some sort of potentiatory effect for later hypertrophy training. So the kind of the point of all this is that there theoretically could be a case in which uh, taking a couple weeks off or decreasing training volume substantially could lead to greater hypertrophy. But where I think this gets taken too far a lot of the time is that you can see it discussed as like a minor decrease in training volume will lead to this, or a very short period of time will lead to this. From my reading of the research and all the papers that I think are relevant here, I think it needs a pretty substantial drop in training volume, and I think that needs to be there for a pretty meaningful amount of time, to elicit meaningful resensitizations, somewhere greater than 2 or 3 weeks, I would say. That said, this is not something that's been super well tested, and it is one of the things Josh and I talk about a lot. Is I think this is one of the areas that I'm most excited about, kind of going forward, with how can we elicit these resensitization effects in trained individuals. What can we kind of get away with in terms of the training stimulus to continue to maintain muscle size, or maybe just decrease the dosage substantially, that we're still growing but maybe not quite at the same rate. There's a ton of different things here, but ultimately, if you're asking me from a practical standpoint today, would I intentionally take weeks off to resensitize myself to muscle growth? Probably not. From a physiological perspective, I think the evidence is interesting, but not super supportive, and to say like this is definitely something you should do and kind of include in your training. But I would kind of lean on that in terms of like a potentially neutral to positive effect. If that were to happen just based on travel or things like that, there could be a nice little positive there if that does in fact happen. But I think we're still waiting for more research on this that I do find pretty interesting. This topic is pretty cool, and I think this is the area that periodization for hypertrophy. I think this is kind of the variable that I would find the most compelling if we can kind of do some more research on this moving forward. But to answer the question directly, I don't think that's why you should take 1 to 2 weeks off. But if you were to take 1 to 2 weeks off, that might be a nice little bonus potentially.
Yeah, that what you said at the end is very much what I wanted to emphasize. I don't go out of my way to quote unquote resensitize in practice, but I will oftentimes be like, hey, this what we kind of have to do because of potential logistical constraints, whether that is, someone has a scheduling conflict for a couple weeks, or they're going on vacation, or they just don't have the time to train with 20 sets per muscle group year round. You can take kind of like a volume cycling approach. And based on this research, it looks like a neutral to potentially slight positive effect on muscle growth, even though you're kind of taking this volume cycling approach as opposed to having um, a constant volume year round, or whatever the case may be. So, like what we can gain from the research, or at least what it seems like right now, is that resensitization definitely does occur, in the sense that your rate of muscle growth is definitely faster after periods of detraining, but we're not sure if that approach in the populations we care about would ever lead to greater net muscle growth. That's still not clear. We have a criminally low amount of evidence on the topic, but it is very, very interesting because it has very important practical implications for obviously body composition. So someone more focused on physique outcomes, but also I think for strength athletes as well.
The other thing I was going to add real quick is the other area that I do think I would tend to agree based on the limited evidence that we have, but I think is sometimes taken a little bit too far as well, is kind of countering the negative of this. So let's say you do take 1 to 2 weeks off training. For pretty well trained individuals, you're going to hear tons of citations of this study by Bickle and colleagues to say that you can maintain training adaptations on considerably lower volumes than it took to accumulate those adaptations. And while for the most part, leaning on anecdote here, I think that actually is true to say that you can maintain adaptation in considerably less training than it took you to get through there. I do think the training status of the participants there is like particularly relevant. I think we've talked about this a few times on the podcast, but there's some interesting case studies looking at like very well trained individuals going through deloads and things like that, where there are some loss of either muscle size or potentially performance depending on the training phase, that I do think is relevant in this conversation just to bring up, to say that, for trained individuals, I don't know if you can definitely maintain everything with very, very low training volumes. So there may be a small cost there that is worth bringing up. But anecdotally, I would still lean on what we kind of discussed earlier to say that for the most part, I wouldn't go out of my way to do that because of those factors that could potentially kind of counter the small positives that we would bring up just in super well trained individuals. We just don't have very conclusive data on this by any means. But that said, what we're saying is that if your schedule or something else does dictate some time off or some lower volume periods, let's just take solace in the fact that there could be a slight positive there in terms of resensitization when you don't really have another option. So I think that is kind of just an additional factor to bring up, that while I do think you can definitely maintain on lower volumes, the degree to which that's true for like actually well-trained individuals, I'm not entirely sold on, with some of the tangential lines of evidence there.
Yeah. If I were to take a kind of a volume cycling approach in practice, it would probably be better characterized as going from moderate to high, and cycling through that. Um, so, for example, like some individuals will have a really hard time pushing both squat and deadlift training and specific squat and deadlift training at the same time, and as well as accessories for both of those lifts at the same time. So you can kind of deprioritize one, and that doesn't mean go into 1/3 of the volume or 1/9 of the volume, but instead, hey, let's put it a little bit on the back burner, maybe adjust exercise order a little bit to deprioritize it, maybe drop volume down to like 70 to 80% of what you would normally do. And let's put the lift we are prioritizing. Let's put it earlier in sessions. Let's make sure the rhythm of the training week is kind of optimized for that lift. And yeah, maybe we can get away with adding 20% of the volume on that, uh, on that specific work. But yeah, a lot more to be a lot more to learn here for sure. But I think it's a very interesting concept, because I think the downstream uh, effects are huge, and we're starting to see some indication in the research that, what you were doing before the current training phase might have some influence on your response. Right? We have the Scarparelli study or Scarpelli study. There's the recent one we did a podcast on, talking about work capacity, and aerobic training potentiating um, hypertrophy potentially. So there's a lot of interesting things kind of floating around out there, but we don't have a cohesive picture yet. And I think this is like something that I think we could look back on in 10 years, be like, okay, this concept is a game changer now that we have whatever 10, 12 studies on it. So yeah, sweet.
Cool.
Any other thoughts on that, or you want to read me into the
Nope.
next one?
I'll read you into the big one here.
Cool.
So yeah, as we kind of talked on the front end here, the kind of the main topic of today's podcast is going over our most recent newsletter that was spearheaded by Mr. Josh here, and this was on a recent study that was really well timed, because I think there was a review paper that kind of talked about this concept a few months ago. I can't remember exactly when that came out.
By the same lead author.
Yeah, so that got a lot of chatter on social media, things like that. But the obvious conclusion there was, man, this is really cool concept. We don't really have any direct evidence that is, directly examining this question. And then of course we get this paper published, which is a really nice follow up. So with that said, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah. So specifically, the question that the previous review paper looked at, which is probably best characterized as kind of a correlational look at this concept, whereas this is the first experimental look at this concept, and that concept is, what we should do with training volume in a deficit. Um, I'll kind of get into the, I guess, more common perspectives on that historically, but just from a very, very high level. This, I think, is very relevant for this concept of nutritional periodization that we've talked about a good bit on the podcast, which is basically trying to pair our training strategies with nutrition strategies in order to maximize outcomes. Kind of the downstream benefits on body composition as a result of that, and subsequently on strength outcomes if that's your jam. So this is a very nice step in learning more about this concept. There's still a lot to be learned. We're going to talk about some of the limitations, but I was very excited to see this paper again. First kind of experimental look at this question. So I think, if we just think of like general opinions that have probably been floating around for in previous years, some will argue that training volume should be reduced when in a caloric deficit due to reduced recovery capacity. Right. So if you don't have as many recovery resources, then go ahead and reduce training volume. That can make sure you're still benefiting from the training you are doing. So that's kind of one perspective that might have some merit. The other perspective, I think, also might come pretty intuitive to a lot of people, is that training volume should be increased in order to maximize the likelihood of retaining muscle mass. Right? We know that at least to a point, there's a dose response relationship between training volume and increases in muscle size. So it seems pretty intuitive. If I'm trying to uh, retain as much muscle as possible, maybe even gain some muscle, I'm going to crank up the volume. So again, that's the other side of the fence up until this point. Um, so let's think about that relationship between volume and hypertrophy for a little bit, specifically in the case of a caloric deficit. And this will kind of contextualize like why this study, I guess, was designed the way it was. So we obviously know, and we have direct evidence that resistance training will spare lean mass when losing weight, and that's pretty intuitive, right? If you lose weight without and you're doing no exercise, no resistance training, you're going to lose some muscle mass alongside that. If you drop body weight while resistance training, you're either going to lose no muscle mass, maybe even gain some muscle mass, or at the very least attenuate the loss of muscle mass. Right? That's pretty intuitive. But we also know from studies in kind of like a eukaloric condition, or I guess you could just call them regular studies, so no caloric restriction for the subjects. We know that there is likely a point of too much volume in those studies. So kind of the question here is whether this relationship changes when you're in a deficit, right? So again, increasing training volume leads to better increases in muscle size up into a point, and then eventually it seems that there's a point of too much volume. So the question is, does that relationship change? Is it still a dose response relationship? Does kind of the point of too much change? Does it increase? Does it decrease? So as a result of that, these subjects kind of did a normal volume study, if they will. They had 38 total subjects, and they put they randomized half of them into a lower volume group and the other half into a higher volume group. And the idea is, okay, we can look at body composition changes, and we can see if one does better on that front, right? That ideally retains as much lean mass as possible. So the next question is, okay, you're saying higher volume, you're saying lower volume. Well, like go ahead and define that. So I want to focus on the lower body training. It's a little bit more relevant for the outcomes they reported, and also just for the sake of time, because the concepts can kind of also be applied to the upper body as well. So they performed 2 lower body sessions per week, and in each of those sessions, subjects did leg press, leg extension, leg curl, and calf raises. For the leg press, leg extension, and leg curl, the higher volume group did 5 sets per session, And the lower volume group did 3 sets per session for each of those exercises. Then for calf raises, the higher volume group did 3 sets per session, and the lower volume group did 1 set per session. So if we just isolate the quads there, basically the higher volume group was doing 10 sets per week, and the lower volume group was doing 6 sets per week for the quads. So I'm purposefully saying higher and not high volume because I think a lot would argue that 10 isn't necessarily high. Um, but we're at least comparing two different volume levels to start to get some insight on this question. So um, the actual intervention period in which the subjects were in a deficit was 6 weeks, and I don't even think it's worth talking about like the prescribed calorie intake, because what actually matters is how much weight they actually lost, right? And then we can kind of back calculate from there, like what was the rate of weight loss. And the two groups lost almost identical amounts of total body weight. That was about 1.7 kilos in each group on average. And this is actually a pretty slow cut for both of these groups. It comes out to about a third of 8% of body weight per week, which again is on the slower side. It's not super slow. It's definitely detectable. But it would have been nice to see that be more like, I don't know, 0.75% of weight loss per week. So we can really look at this question in a more extreme scenario, if you will.
One question real quick, Josh. I'm just looking at the training table real quick. Um, did so? What were the weekly volumes again? I was just thinking because I think it says they were perform them twice per week.
Right. Okay. Yes, you are right there. So for the quads, it would be 20 sets versus 16 sets.
There we go.
I think I had the hamstrings in mind because the hamstrings did basically 10 sets per week
Yep.
versus six sets per week.
There we go.
So so it would be 20 versus 12, not 20 versus 16. 20 versus 12 for the quads.
Which I think is a
Um,
really good comparison. Like,
which yeah, which is definitely a good comparison, but again, different set volumes per week kind of mean different things to different people. So again, I'm trying not to make a value judgment in terms of whether it was high versus low volume. Instead, just say, yeah, this one was higher volume, this one was lower volume. But that's good catch, because I definitely misspoke there. 20 sets versus 12 sets for the quads. Um, I will say the quads were the only exercise that had two um, two exercises. Like if you look at the upper body work, the bench press was basically the only direct chest work, and that was 10 sets per week compared to 6 sets per week. And they reported total lean body mass changes and total body fat changes. So that is relevant that really for most muscles, volumes for both groups were on the lower side. But for the quads, they were a little bit higher. Now, the they did look at also rectus femoris muscle thickness, which I thought was interesting, and that's why I purposely pointed out the quads. And I think this is the reason I made the
yeah,
mistake is
I was just
because
gonna say, yeah.
they looked at rectus femoris muscle thickness, and the rectus femoris crosses both the hip and the knee. So we'll kind of spare you of the longer explanation of this, but basically, it's unlikely that a leg press is going to grow the rectus femoris a ton. And instead, the leg extension is really the only direct rectus femoris training that the subjects got. So I wrote this in the newsletter is that like we're really looking at 10 sets per week for the rectus femoris versus 6 sets per week for the rectus femoris. And again, I think that's kind of why I misspoke there. Um, and they reported the changes in ultrasound muscle thickness of that muscle. And basically, there was no change in either group in terms of just over time, whether the muscle thickness went up or down. No significant change over time, and also no significant differences between groups. So basically, no change in muscle size, nothing really to write home about in terms of muscle thickness. Now, they looked at body composition. They reported lean mass change and also body fat percentage change, which was measured through BIA, which we might talk about a little bit more. Overall, I think that is an okay measurement to use on the group level. It probably gives us, a pretty good insight of what's going on overall. There is some validity data comparing it to ADEXA change on the group level, probably not the most reliable measurement. And thus, this subject or this study had a good amount of subjects, 38 total. So one could argue that, there was enough subjects to see if there was something going on here, if there was. But one could also, on the other hand, make the argument that given the measurement tools, this might not have been the most powered study to detect probably a pretty small change between groups that we might actually care about in practice. But both groups did lose a significant amount of body fat. In terms of the absolute amounts there, it was about 1% for the higher volume group in terms of loss of body fat percentage, and the lower volume group lost about 1.2% of body fat. And then both groups also lost a significant amount of lean mass. So the higher volume group lost about half a kilo of lean mass, and the lower volume group lost about 0.92 kilos of lean mass. All of those changes within groups were significant, meaning all groups lost a significant amount of lean mass and also a significant amount of body fat. But the between group comparisons were not significantly different. So from the analyses that they reported, there was no difference between groups in changes in rectus femoris muscle size, body fat percentage, or lean mass changes. Now, if you were going to take a very liberal interpretation, you could read into this a good amount, especially if your bias is more on the higher volume side, and you could say that in terms of the total body weight lost, compared to how much of that was lean mass, in the higher volume group, only about 30% of the body weight lost was lean mass based on the figures they reported, and in the lower volume group, it was about 52%. So again, you could overinterpret this and be like, oh, higher volumes maintain lean mass almost twice as well. But given some of the limitations of the measurement devices used, I wouldn't read into that too much. But it also could, mean that there is something going on here. We just didn't have enough precision to detect it, if you will. But overall, I don't think we can conclusively say that either group saw, or had better results overall. I'm going to mention one quick thing about, and this is a general consideration with BIA, and then I'll see if you have anything to chime in here, Zach. You might be curious, like, why did these subjects lose lean mass? They didn't really have an aggressive deficit. It was about 0.33% per week of body mass loss, which again is on the slower side. I think with a good resistance training program, and as long as you're not doing anything crazy outside of the gym, I think you're going to see lean mass retention at the very least. And probably, especially in subjects that might not have had like a really good training program beforehand, I think you might even see lean mass accretion or a gain in lean mass. But I would encourage the listener not to read too much into those changes in lean mass. The reason being, and this is something that I'm only vaguely aware of the concept, but I believe that BIA doesn't do a great job when there are changes in body weight and looking at the relative kind of contribution of those changes. Or in other words, if someone loses weight and you're looking at BIA changes, even if lean mass was truly retained, it might kind of indicate that the absolute change was negative. So what I'm more interested in here are the between group comparisons as opposed to the kind of within group absolute changes in lean mass specifically. I feel pretty good about the body fat one, or at least in comparison. But I think you could be like, this study kind of throw it out because it wasn't even a good program. They didn't even retain lean mass. But I would encourage people to think more about the between group differences as opposed to that alternative explanation.
Good stuff. So I don't have a ton of like questions on the methods of the study, anything like that. I thought you did a really good job describing that. And in hindsight, I very much see why you said 10 and 6 sets now. So apologize for bringing that up unnecessarily.
Oh, to
I
be
got
clear, I very much misspoke. So I'm glad you said it.
it's all good. It's all good. So I guess the main thing to me is like, okay, relatively inconclusive findings. Um, I would say, if we can say much, both of these approaches seem to be viable alternatives to one another. Like you could use either approach. How does this inform your like individual decision making? You know, you have a client, whether to maintain, decrease, increase their training volume. Like, how does this study play into the factors you would consider when you're actually making that determination on the individual level, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that leads me to probably the biggest limitation of this study in terms of practical application. So I'll go into that, and I think that'll just kind of open the conversation up to a more practical perspective. So if you think about the study design here, is they basically took trained subjects that were presumably training consistently beforehand, and they basically said, "Hey, you're going to perform this amount of volume, or you're going to perform this lower amount of volume, or higher, whatever the case, right?" And that doesn't actually reflect how this would happen in practice. The question we actually want to know in practice is, okay, right now I'm doing 15 sets for my chest. I'm about to cut now, right? Maybe I was in a slight surplus before. Now I'm going to cut for 8 weeks. Should I go up to 20, or should I go down to 10? Should I stay at 15? Well, what's the answer there? This study doesn't actually answer that, because that's not how it was experimentally designed. And we can't really get any hints about it either, because they didn't report pre training volumes. Again, that wouldn't experimentally answer the question uh, that I just proposed, but it would at least potentially give us a little bit of insight, because especially if we think about the rectus femoris, I'd guess that some of the subjects were doing 15 sets of leg extensions per week. Maybe they're doing 3 leg days a week and they're doing 5 sets of leg extensions at the end. So their pre-training rectus femoris volume was 15. Whereas I bet a lot of the subjects as well were doing no leg extension sets per week. Maybe they're just squatting twice a week or 3 times a week, whatever the case may be. So you have, I'm guessing, a very wide range in changes in training volume when they entered these respective protocols. So I think that really limits our practical interpretation from this. Now, to be fair, there are, as we know very intimately, that there are serious logistical considerations when doing research in terms of the actual data collection. And I think the authors were aware of this. They did have a 1 week period before they started the 6 week intervention, in which both of the groups were at the volumes of that lower volume group, and then they took the subjects in the higher volume group and had them increase it for the 6 weeks, and they just kept that lower volume group at the lower volume. That's something, but unfortunately, I just don't think that 1 week of a standardized training volume is going to do the job. Again, better than nothing, but probably doesn't account for everything there. Um, so, in terms of a practical application, my take home from this is that there doesn't seem to be a clear benefit to higher volumes over lower volumes, or vice versa. Um, and if we think about how that influences our practical application in terms of whether volume should go up or down, again, we can't say anything directly about it, but that tells me that there isn't a change in that relationship necessarily when entering a deficit. And I don't think it makes sense to do much proactively in terms of changes in training volume when someone enters a cut. I think you can do it reactively. And in my opinion, if you're going to make changes, it should probably be in the downward direction. I don't think adding volume in a cut really makes sense at all, just at face value. Um, my thinking goes something like this, and Zach, you can let me know if I'm missing something here. But in my opinion, if you could handle and benefit from higher training volumes before the cut, when you were at maintenance or in a surplus, you should have been doing that all along, right? There's no reason that you're going to be able to handle and benefit from more volume while in a cut. That just doesn't pass the face validity test. Of course, there is the exception if you are purposefully not training optimally before the cut, or even accidentally. Maybe you just didn't have a good training program, or you didn't have the time to train as much as you would like. But if you were presumably trying to optimize things before a cut and then you enter a cut, it really doesn't make sense why you would add volume. I think it makes sense to maintain your training volume until you feel like recovery capacity is at a point where a volume reduction is almost required. In my experience, especially with strength athletes that are typically going to be doing less aggressive cuts and also shorter duration cuts than someone that is trying to get peeled for the summer, uh, volume doesn't really need to budge very much. So that's my practical opinion. And again, it's very much anecdote driven and just kind of taking these high level concepts from the research and trying to apply them the best we can. We don't have direct experimental evidence on that, so take it with a grain of salt. Um, but I'll be curious if Zach, you can poke any holes in that.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think the anecdotes of this question, I think, could be potentially illusory depending on how you're making them. Like, I was literally thinking the exact same thing that you said. The only real way that that anecdote could emerge is if you are not at the theoretical highest training volume you can benefit from, pre-deficit. Um, because that obviously could be the case. If you enter a deficit, and we've talked about this a few times, like that psychological ducks in the row analogy, where I'm not on the deficit, I'm making all my meals, getting everything ready for the morning the next day, everything's just more organized. You know what? I start track and training a little bit better. I start warming up a little bit better. I start coming into the gym with more focus, maybe a little bit of extra caffeine. I start hitting the gym at the same time every day. Like there's all those additional factors that start adding up that I can't think of the word, artificially increase the training volume, which you can benefit from. But that's not because you need to do additional volume in a deficit. That's simply because if that was the case all along, that probably was where you should have been the entire time. And if anything, the additional constraints of the deficit will bring that number down. But you could go back up to that, start to benefit from it, and say, oh, I increased my volume in a deficit, where in one sense you did do that. In another sense, I don't really think that's an accurate description of how this relationship probably plays out. So I'm totally on board with that. The question and the situation we are talking about is in the case of an individual who has spent an adequate amount of time, let's say 10 months, figuring out the training dose and organization of training that fits well for them and they think they can maximally benefit from. When you enter a deficit, is there a proactive change that needs to be made in that case? And in that situation, I as you said, I struggle to see a scenario in which that would go up.
Yeah, I very much agree. Um, I think we definitely are on the same page, and I don't know, maybe there is a good argument, kind of against what we're saying, at least from a theoretical perspective. And if
Only thing I thought of was additional energy expenditure. If there is not a cost to it, maybe that's a convenient way to provide more exercise oriented calorie deficit as opposed to a dietary
sure,
calorie deficit that maybe is additional protein intake. Maybe that's going to help
yeah.
you. That's totally theoretical. I'm trying to come up with caveats and plays devil's advocate to our position because, as you said, just intuitively, it doesn't really seem to offer many arguments in my head why you would want to do that. But I'm
Yeah.
trying to come up with something.
Yeah, I think, but kind of where I was going with that is like there definitely could be practical situations where you do increase volume when you enter a cut because, like you said, you might get your ducks in a row, so you might be able to kind of handle things. It's funny you say that because I think it was literally like 2 days before the recording of this, someone in our individualized programming group was like, "Hey, I'm hitting a bunch of PRs in a deficit. Like, what's going on?" And I was like, "This isn't as uncommon as you think, especially those first, you know, 4, 5, 6 weeks of a deficit before you really can even notice a influence on recovery capacity. I think a lot of people get more excited to train because they're seeing these week to week changes in the way their body looks. And that's just generally motivating for this whole process overall. Um, they, like you said, meal prep might be on point, sleep might be on point. And yeah, I mean theoretically you might be able to tolerate and benefit from higher volumes, but I think that's separate from the actual energy status that you're in, or at least the acute energy status, I should say, that you're in. So yeah, I very much agree there. Um, Another practical situation where, I'm kind of reflecting on times I have increased volume proactively when someone enters a cut is if someone is entering a cut and simultaneously shifting goals, but this would be more on the local level. So I'm thinking of a lifter that has both strength and hypertrophy goals. And they, whatever, just spent 8 months focusing on the strength side of things. Maybe they were at maintenance or a slight surplus. Hey, I want to go ahead and spend the next 3 months dropping a good amount of body fat. Yeah, maybe we're going to increase arm volume there because what you were doing before was suboptimal arm volume because we were so focused on strength. But again, I'll kind of come back to that tenet of it doesn't make sense if you were doing optimal training beforehand. I think those are important caveats to keep in mind because I don't want people to be like, oh, I was focused on strength and I was doing 3 sets of biceps a week. Now I'm focused on body composition and losing weight. So I'm going to stay at 3 sets per week because episode 43 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Definitely not what we're saying. There's a couple of prerequisites there, if you will. Zach, do you have anything to add on that topic? Okay, cool. I just want to quickly talk about a couple of what I would characterize as programming wrinkles that I would probably add before I actually adjust the overall training dose, or you probably better characterized as the overall training volume, or more easily identified as the overall training volume. I like to think of this as like having a course dial for overall workload and having a fine dial for overall workload. And if you go to our website and you click the articles tab and then you click the newsletter tab and you read this newsletter, you can see at the bottom there's a little infographic there of some kind of programming strategies or programming wrinkles for strength athletes specifically when in a caloric deficit that I've just anecdotally found work pretty well. And again, the idea is that when you're at maintenance or in a slight surplus, you might be able to get away with, and you might be able to get away with the alternative of these recommendations. Whereas in a deficit, you might want to play it a little bit more on the safer side. And I would again probably do these before I actually change the overall volume because we know that volume is probably going to drive adaptations to a large extent. So the first kind of programming change or programming wrinkle you might add in a caloric deficit is to have less aggressive within block increases in training variables. So let's take a secondary squat day, for example, right? Someone's doing pause squats. Maybe your normal approach is to add 1 RPE per week, which is relatively aggressive, right? Maybe you hang out around RP6 that first week. By the last week, you're at RP9. Whereas in a deficit, I might just be a little bit more conservative with that, especially on something like a secondary day. I might, start them at a 6 RP and maybe we finish more at like a 7.5 or an 8 RP by the end of the block. Just a little bit more conservative in those week tweak changes because recovery capacity might be down just a touch. The second one is more frequent deloads. Just anecdotally, some lifters just seem to run out of steam a little bit sooner in a block. And I would probably rather be more on the proactive side of things in terms of deloads when in deficit as opposed to on the reactive side of things. So that's the second one. The third one is less mentally taxing exercises. So if you're doing a high bar squat for some quad hypertrophy work, obviously that's still pretty specific. Maybe you swap that out for a leg press. That can just be a little bit less intimidating when you're going in, I guess, potentially hungry and maybe just feeling a little bit run down from the deficit in training. It can help to ensure that training quality is as high as possible throughout the entire session by doing those less mentally taxing exercises. The fourth and final one is to place squat and deadlift training on different days. I think it's hard, especially when you're in a deficit, to stare down a day where maybe you have both a heavy squat day and a heavy deadlift day, and maybe some accessories for each of those lifts right after. So something I've found helpful in practice is just go ahead, break those up. It's a little bit easier to approach each of those in isolation. So those are a few things that definitely are not mandatory when in a deficit, but I just wanted to throw them out there as kind of some fine dial adjustments and give you a little bit of idea fuel for being a little bit proactive with fatigue management for strength athletes when in a caloric deficit.
Cosign.
Right on. All right, that's all we have for episode 43. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you're not already subscribed to the Training Takeaway newsletter, make sure you do so. We'll make sure that is linked in the show notes or in the description of this video. And we'll see you in episode 44. Take care.
See you guys.